Before we dive into this remarkable story, if you find yourself moved by tales of quiet sacrifice and unexpected strength, please take a moment to share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the smallest gesture of connection can change everything, and your subscription helps us bring more of these stories to light. There are moments in life that cut so deep, so raw, that you carry them with you every single day, like a stone in your shoe that never stops rubbing, never stops reminding you. But there are other moments, rare ones, that carve something else entirely, something that grows so quietly, so secretly, that by the time it blooms, it has already changed everything. This is one of those stories. This is a story about a man who had every reason to walk away, every reason to let bitterness eat him alive, but who chose instead to build something beautiful in the shadows. This is a story about Frank Morrison. And it begins, as all great stories do, with a secret recipe. Before I take you into the depths of this remarkable journey, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the last time you felt truly powerless. Think about the last time you watched someone you love being pushed down, being told they weren't enough, being stripped of their dreams, and you could do nothing but stand there and watch. Feel that helplessness for just a moment. Because that is exactly where Frank Morrison found himself on a Thursday evening in September, when his daughter Emily walked into his restaurant and told him it was time to retire. Frank Morrison had been smoking meat for 40 years. He'd started as a young man in his mid-20s, fresh out of the army, looking for something to do with his hands and his heart. He'd grown up in a small town in Texas, the son of a butcher who'd taught him everything he knew about meat and fire and patience. His father had been a hard man, a quiet man, a man who expressed his love through the food he prepared rather than the words he spoke. "Sit down, boy," his father would say, sliding a plate of brisket across the table. "Eat. And don't talk with your mouth full." Frank had learned to cook from his father, and he'd learned to dream from his mother. She'd been the one who encouraged him to open his own restaurant, who'd told him that his barbecue was the best she'd ever tasted, who'd pushed him to take a chance on himself when everyone else told him he was crazy. "You've got a gift, Frank," she'd said, her hands flour dusted from the biscuits she'd been making. "The good Lord gave you a gift. Don't you waste it." Frank had opened his first restaurant in 1984, a small hole-in-the-wall place in a strip mall on the outskirts of Phoenix. He'd had 3 tables, a second-hand smoker he'd bought from a closing restaurant, and a dream that burned brighter than the oak wood in his pit. The first few years had been rough. There'd been days when he'd served more customers than he had, when he'd had to turn people away because he'd run out of meat. There'd been nights when he'd sat alone in the empty restaurant, counting pennies, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. But he'd kept going. He'd kept working. He'd kept perfecting his recipes, refining his techniques, learning from his mistakes. And slowly, steadily, word had spread. Frank's barbecue had become a legend. By the time Frank turned 40, he'd moved to a larger location, a proper restaurant with a proper dining room and a proper smoker pit out back. He'd hired his first employees, a handful of young cooks who were as passionate about barbecue as he was. He'd built a reputation for quality that was second to none, a reputation that would eventually make Frank's Barbecue one of the most beloved restaurants in the state. The restaurant had become a cornerstone of the community. Families would come in on weekends, filling the booths with laughter and the smell of smoked meat. Couples would have their first dates there, their anniversaries there, their celebrations there. Frank had become a local celebrity of sorts, a man who was known for his generosity as much as his cooking. He'd donate food to charity events, sponsor little league teams, give jobs to troubled kids who needed a second chance. "I'm not just a cook," Frank would tell people. "I'm a part of this community. And this community is a part of me." The secret to Frank's Barbecue wasn't really a secret at all. It was patience. It was respect for the meat and the fire. It was understanding that good barbecue couldn't be rushed, couldn't be shortcut, couldn't be faked. You had to start with the right ingredients. You had to trim the meat just right. You had to season it with a dry rub that Frank had spent years perfecting, a blend of spices and herbs that danced on the tongue without overwhelming the flavor of the meat. And you had to smoke it low and slow for hours, sometimes 12, sometimes 14, sometimes 18 hours, until the fat had rendered and the meat had become so tender it fell apart at the slightest touch. But there was one thing that set Frank's Barbecue apart from all the others. One ingredient that no one could quite figure out. It was the sauce, a thick, tangy, slightly sweet concoction that Frank served on the side. People would drive for hours just to taste it. They'd ask him what was in it, and he'd smile and say, "Just a little bit of this and a whole lot of that." The truth was, the sauce had been Frank's father's recipe, passed down through generations, tweaked and perfected over the years. Frank's father had learned it from his father, who'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from a man who'd learned it from a man who'd learned it from someone who'd learned it from someone who'd learned it from. Well, the story got a little fuzzy after a while. But the recipe was real, and it was Frank's most prized possession. He kept it in a small leather journal, tucked away in a fireproof safe in his office. The journal had been his father's, and his father's before that, going back who knew how many generations. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the handwriting faded and spidery, but the recipe was still there, written in ink that had barely faded with time. Frank would open the journal sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was closed and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, and he'd read his father's words and feel connected to something bigger than himself. "Dad," he'd whisper into the empty room, "I hope I'm making you proud." Emily had been born in 1988, a tiny bundle of joy who'd arrived 3 weeks early and announced her presence with a wail that could be heard across the hospital. Frank had held her in his arms, tears streaming down his face, and promised himself that he would give this child everything. Everything he'd never had growing up. Everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. He'd kept that promise. Emily had gone to the best private schools, had worn the best clothes, had never wanted for anything. Frank had paid for her college education at Arizona State University, had bought her a brand new car when she turned 16, had given her a generous allowance that continued well into her 20s. He'd done everything he could to make sure his daughter had a better life than he'd had made sure she never had to struggle the way he'd struggled. But somewhere along the way, Frank had made a mistake. He'd given Emily everything, but he hadn't taught her the value of anything. He'd showered her with gifts, but he hadn't shown her how to work. He'd provided for her, but he hadn't prepared her. Emily had grown up with a sense of entitlement that Frank hadn't noticed until it was too late. She'd grown up believing that the world owed her something, that things would be handed to her just because she deserved them. She'd grown up with a hunger for more, a hunger that could never be satisfied. "I don't understand why you're still working so hard, Dad," Emily would say, watching him come home exhausted after a long day at the restaurant. "You've already made enough money. You could retire and live comfortably. Why are you still killing yourself?" Frank would smile tiredly and say, "It's not about the money, sweetheart. It's about the love. I love what I do. I love the people I serve. I love being part of something meaningful." Emily would nod, but her eyes would betray her confusion. She didn't understand love. She didn't understand passion. She understood one thing only: money. Mark had entered the picture in 2012. He'd been charming and handsome, with a winning smile and an easy manner that had won Emily over immediately. He'd worked as a sales representative for a food distribution company, and he'd impressed Frank with his knowledge of the industry and his ambition. "Mr. Morrison," Mark had said, shaking Frank's hand firmly, "I've been following your restaurant for years. You're a legend in this town. I'd be honored to learn from you." Frank had felt a surge of pride. "Well, son, you're welcome to come by any time. I can always use another pair of hands." Mark had taken Frank up on the offer. He'd started coming by the restaurant in the evenings, after his regular job, helping out with prep work and cleaning up. He'd been eager to learn, always asking questions, always taking notes. Frank had been impressed with his dedication, his work ethic, his genuine interest in the business. "Emily's lucky to have found a good man like you," Frank had told Mark one evening, after they'd finished closing up. Mark had smiled, a humble smile. "I'm the lucky one, Frank. Emily's special. She's been through a lot, and she deserves someone who'll treat her right." Frank had nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. He'd hoped that Mark would be good for Emily, that he'd teach her the values she'd never learned, that he'd help her become the woman Frank had always hoped she'd be. He'd been wrong. Mark was a master manipulator, a man who'd learned how to tell people what they wanted to hear. He'd seen Emily as a ticket to success, a way to get his hands on Frank's restaurant and Frank's money. He'd played the long game, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first signs of trouble had been subtle. Emily had started spending more time at the restaurant, ostensibly to help her father with the day-to-day operations. She'd take over the books, she'd said. She'd handle the payroll, she'd said. She'd manage the schedule, she'd said. And Frank, who'd been feeling the weight of his years, had been grateful for the help. "You're getting older, Dad," Emily had said one evening, sitting in his office, reviewing the accounts. "You can't keep doing this forever. Let me help. Let me take some of the burden off your shoulders." Frank had sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I know, sweetheart. It's just. This restaurant is my life. It's all I've ever known. And it's my legacy," Emily had said, her voice smooth and persuasive. "I want to carry on your tradition. I want to make you proud." Frank had felt a lump form in his throat. He'd nodded, unable to speak. He was proud of Emily. He'd always been proud of Emily. And now she was stepping up, showing the kind of responsibility he'd always hoped she'd develop. Over the following months, Emily had gradually taken over more and more of the restaurant's operations. She'd handled the ordering, the scheduling, the payroll. She'd met with suppliers, negotiated contracts, managed the budget. Frank had been impressed with her efficiency, her competence, her dedication. He'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the restaurant would be in good hands when he finally decided to retire. What he hadn't realized was that Emily wasn't managing the restaurant. She was documenting it. She was learning every aspect of the business, every detail of the operations, every nuance of the recipes. She was preparing to take it all for herself. "She's been taking notes," one of Frank's longtime employees, a cook named Carlos, had mentioned to him one evening. "I've seen her writing things down, making lists, copying recipes. She's been in your office, going through your files." Frank had dismissed the concern. "She's just trying to learn, Carlos. She's my daughter. She has every right to know how the business works." Carlos had shrugged, but his eyes had been uneasy. "I don't know, Frank. Something doesn't feel right. I've been working here for 20 years, and I've never seen her so intense. It's like she's planning something." Frank had brushed it off, but Carlos's words had stuck with him. Over the next few weeks, he'd started paying closer attention to Emily's behavior, and he'd noticed things he hadn't noticed before. The way she'd disappear into his office for hours at a time. The way she'd make phone calls in hushed tones. The way she'd look at him with something that wasn't quite love. The conversation about retirement came a few weeks later. Emily had invited Frank to dinner at her house, a dinner she'd prepared herself, a dinner that was clearly meant to soften him up for a request she knew he wouldn't want to hear. "Dad, you're 65 years old," Emily had said, setting a plate of roasted chicken in front of him. "You've been working 40 years. You deserve to rest. You deserve to enjoy life." Frank had picked at his chicken, his appetite gone. "I enjoy my work, Emily. I enjoy being at the restaurant. I enjoy seeing my customers. I enjoy—" "I know you do," she'd interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "But I'm asking you to consider something. I'm asking you to let me take over. Let me run the restaurant. You can still be involved, of course. You can still come in, talk to customers, oversee the cooking. But I'll handle the day-to-day operations. I'll take care of everything." Frank had stared at his daughter. "You want me to step down? I want you to retire, Dad. It's time. You've worked long enough." Frank had looked around the dining room, at the comfortable furniture, the tasteful decorations, the evidence of his daughter's success. She was doing well. She'd made a good life for herself. And now she was asking for the one thing he wasn't ready to give. "Let me think about it," he'd said finally. Emily had smiled, a warm smile, a smile that made her look like the little girl he'd raised. "Take all the time you need, Dad. I'm not going anywhere." But Frank had seen the impatience behind her smile, the calculation in her eyes. She wasn't patient. She wasn't willing to wait. She wanted what she wanted, and she was going to get it, one way or another. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. Emily had become more demanding, more insistent, more aggressive in her pursuit of control. She'd started making changes to the restaurant without consulting Frank, had started hiring and firing employees without his approval, had started ordering supplies he'd never approved. "It's for the good of the business, Dad," she'd say when he'd complain. "You need to trust me. I know what I'm doing." But Frank didn't trust her. He couldn't. Something in her eyes had changed, something in her voice had hardened. She'd become a stranger, a woman he didn't recognize, a woman who looked like his daughter but didn't act like her. "I don't like this, Frank," his wife, Margaret, had said one evening. Margaret had been Frank's rock for 35 years, the woman who'd supported him through every challenge, who'd celebrated every triumph, who'd loved him through every failure. "I don't like it either," Frank had admitted. "But I don't know what to do. She's my daughter. I can't just cut her off." "Yes, you can," Margaret had said firmly. "She's an adult, Frank. She's made her choices. And if she's going to treat you like this, you have every right to protect yourself." Frank had nodded, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. He'd loved Emily too much to turn his back on her. He'd believed, foolishly, that she'd eventually come to her senses. The phone rang at 8 a.m. Frank was in the kitchen, preparing for the day, his hands coated in flour and his mind on the morning's bread order. He'd been at the restaurant since 6, as he had every day for 40 years, and he was looking forward to a quiet Tuesday. The caller was Emily's attorney, a sharp young woman named Cynthia Harper. She had a voice like honey and a spine of steel, and she made it clear from the first sentence that she wasn't calling to chat. "Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to inform you that your daughter has filed a petition to dissolve your partnership in the restaurant." Frank felt the world tilt. Dissolve the partnership? I own the restaurant. It's my restaurant. She doesn't have any legal claim to it. "I'm afraid that's not accurate," Cynthia said smoothly. "Your daughter is listed as a co-owner on the business registration documents. She has been for the past 7 years. The petition will dissolve the partnership and allow her to take sole control of the business." Frank's hands began to shake. "We don't have a partnership agreement. She's not a partner. She's my daughter. She works for me. She's never invested a single dollar in the business." "The documentation would suggest otherwise," Cynthia replied. "Your daughter has contributed significant resources to the restaurant over the years. She's invested time, money, and expertise. The courts will likely find that she has a legitimate claim." Frank hung up the phone and stared at the wall. The air in the kitchen had grown thick, suffocating. He'd been a fool. He'd given Emily everything, and she'd taken it all. She'd taken his trust, his love, his business. And now she was coming for the one thing he'd held back. The recipe. The recipe was his. It was his father's, his grandfather's, his great-grandfather's. It was a secret that had been passed down through generations, a secret that had never been written down except in the pages of the journal. Emily didn't have it. Emily had never had it. And now Frank realized why she'd been so desperate to get him to retire, why she'd been so insistent that he step down and let her take over. She wanted the restaurant, but more than that, she wanted the recipe. She wanted the key to Frank's success. She wanted to build her empire on his legacy. Frank sat down heavily, his knees weak. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made him sick. He had to fight back. He had to protect what was his. But that meant going against his own daughter, and Frank wasn't sure he had it in him. After the phone call from Cynthia Harper, Frank sat in his office for a long time, staring at nothing. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. His daughter, his own flesh and blood, had filed papers to dissolve their partnership. She was trying to take his restaurant, his life's work, everything he'd built over 40 years. Frank knew he needed to fight back. He needed to protect what was his. But he didn't know how. He didn't know what Emily had on him, what evidence she'd gathered, what lies she'd told. He was flying blind, and he hated it. "Think, Frank," he said to himself, his voice barely a whisper. "Think. What do you know? What do you have?" He thought about the journal, the leather journal his father had given him, the one that held the recipe for his famous barbecue sauce. He'd kept it in a fireproof safe in his office for years, had guarded it like a treasure, had never shared it with anyone. Emily didn't know about it. Emily had never known about it. And that, Frank realized, was his secret weapon. If Emily was going to take his restaurant, she could have it. But she wasn't going to get the recipe. She wasn't going to get the secret that made Frank's barbecue famous. She could have the building, the equipment, the employees. But she couldn't have the sauce. That was his, and his alone. Frank opened the safe, his hands trembling, and pulled out the journal. He held it against his chest, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. His father had given him this journal, had trusted him with the family secret. And now, Frank was going to protect it with everything he had. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to protect what's ours." Over the next few weeks, Frank began to uncover the full extent of Emily's betrayal. It was worse than he'd ever imagined. She hadn't just filed papers to dissolve their partnership. She'd been planning this for years. Frank started going through the restaurant's records, looking for anything that might help him build a case. He found bank statements showing transfers he'd never authorized. He found contracts signed with suppliers he'd never met. He found emails between Emily and an attorney, discussing plans to take over the business. But the worst discovery was yet to come. One evening, Frank was going through the office files, looking for a copy of the partnership agreement, when he found a folder marked New Restaurant. He opened it, and his heart sank. Inside were plans for a new restaurant, a restaurant that Emily and Mark were planning to open. They'd already found a location, already secured financing, already hired a designer. They were going to call it Sizzle, a hip, trendy place that would appeal to a younger crowd. But what really made Frank's blood run cold was the menu. It was his menu. The same dishes he'd been serving for 40 years. The same recipes he'd perfected over a lifetime. They were stealing everything, every single thing he'd built, and they were going to use it to compete against him. Frank felt his knees give way, and he sank into the chair behind the desk. He stared at the folder, the words blurring before his eyes. His daughter, his own daughter, was stealing his life's work. She was taking everything he'd built and using it to build something for herself. "How could you?" Frank whispered, his voice cracking. "How could you do this to me?" The next day, Frank called Emily and asked her to meet him at the restaurant. He needed to confront her, to hear her explain herself, to understand why she'd done what she'd done. Emily arrived at the restaurant looking confident and composed. She was wearing a designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. "Dad," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. "You wanted to see me?" Frank didn't return her smile. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the folder, the one he'd found the night before. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward her. "What's this?" Emily asked, her smile faltering. "Open it," Frank said, his voice flat. "I think you know what it is." Emily opened the folder, and her face went pale. She looked at the plans, the menu, the financial projections. Her hands began to shake. "Dad, I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Frank said. "Tell me why you're stealing my recipes. Tell me why you're planning to open a restaurant to compete against me. Tell me why you're trying to destroy everything I've built." Emily was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was hard, cold, the voice of a stranger. "Because I'm tired of waiting, Dad," she said. "I'm tired of watching you run this restaurant into the ground. I'm tired of being your understudy. I'm tired of being treated like a child when I'm a grown woman." Frank stared at his daughter, his heart breaking. "I never treated you like a child, Emily. I gave you everything. I trusted you. I loved you. You gave me things," Emily said, her voice rising. "But you never gave me respect. You never gave me control. You never gave me the chance to prove myself. You always treated me like I was just your little girl, not a partner, not an equal." "That's not true," Frank said, his voice breaking. "I was trying to protect you. I was trying to teach you. I was trying to..." "Protect me?" Emily laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "You were trying to control me. You wanted to keep me dependent on you. You couldn't stand the thought of me being successful on my own." Frank felt the words like a physical blow. He'd never imagined that Emily felt that way, had never imagined that his love, his protection, his guidance could be interpreted as control. "Emily, I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry you feel that way. But that's not who I am. That's not what I intended." "Intentions don't matter, Dad," Emily said, standing up. "What matters is what's real. And what's real is that I'm going to take this restaurant, and I'm going to build something better. Something that's mine." She walked out of the office, her heels clicking against the tile floor, and Frank sat alone in the silence, his heart shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Frank's attorney, Leonard Schwartz, had been working tirelessly to gather evidence, to build a case, to find a way to stop Emily's takeover. "She's got a strong argument, Frank," Leonard said one afternoon, flipping through a stack of documents. "She's been documenting the business operations for years. She's got bank statements, financial records, business plans. She's presented a comprehensive picture of her involvement in the restaurant." "But she never invested anything," Frank insisted. She helped out. She was doing her job. That's all." "Her job, as you call it, was to take over the business," Leonard said grimly. "And she's done a thorough job of documenting her contributions. I'm not saying she'll win, but she's got a strong argument. And she's got that attorney. Cynthia Harper is tough. She's won cases like this before." Frank slumped in his chair, a sense of despair washing over him. He'd spent 40 years building his restaurant, 40 years perfecting his craft, 40 years creating something meaningful. And now, it was all slipping away. But the worst was yet to come. A few weeks later, Frank walked into the restaurant and found that half his staff had quit. They'd been poached by Emily and Mark, offered better salaries and more opportunities at Sizzle. "I'm sorry, Frank," Carlos said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been offered a position as head chef at their new restaurant. It's more money, more responsibility. I can't turn it down." Frank nodded, his throat tight. "I understand, Carlos. You've got to do what's best for you and your family." "But it's not just the money," Carlos added. "They're promising me creative control. They're promising me a chance to make a name for myself. I've been working here for 20 years, Frank, and I've never had that." Frank felt the words like a knife to his heart. He'd never realized that Carlos felt that way, had never realized that he'd been holding his employees back. "I'm sorry, Carlos," Frank said. "I'm sorry I never gave you more opportunities. I'm sorry I never made you feel valued." Carlos looked away, his eyes glistening. "It's not your fault, Frank. It's time for a change. I hope you understand." Frank nodded, unable to speak. He watched Carlos walk away, watched his best employee leave, and felt a sense of hopelessness wash over him. The worst part was, Carlos was just the first. Over the next few weeks, more employees left, drawn away by the promises of Emily and Mark. The restaurant was bleeding staff, bleeding customers, bleeding money. Frank was losing everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Just when Frank thought things couldn't get any worse, the reviews started appearing online. Scathing reviews, one-star reviews, reviews that accused Frank's barbecue of being unsanitary, of serving spoiled food, of mistreating its employees. Frank read them in disbelief. He'd always taken pride in the cleanliness of his restaurant, had always insisted on the highest standards of food safety. He'd never had a single health violation, had never been cited for anything, had never even had a complaint from a customer. "It's them," Margaret said, after reading one particularly vicious review. "It's Emily and Mark. They're trying to destroy your reputation." Frank shook his head, refusing to believe it. No, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't stoop that low." "Frank, you're being naive," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "They've already stolen your employees, your recipes, your customers. Why wouldn't they try to destroy your reputation too?" Frank had no answer. He sat in his office, staring at the screen, feeling the walls closing in around him. His daughter, his own daughter, was trying to destroy him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, a week before the restaurant was scheduled to close. Frank was sitting in his empty restaurant, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. The tables that had once been filled with laughing customers, the chairs that had once held families and friends, the kitchen that had once hummed with activity. All of it was gone now. All of it was lost. He thought about his father, about the man who'd taught him to cook, about the lessons he'd passed down through generations. He thought about his mother, about the woman who'd encouraged him, believed in him, pushed him to take a chance on himself. He thought about Margaret, about the woman who loved him, supported him, stood by him through every challenge. And he thought about Emily, about the daughter he'd raised, about the woman she'd become. He'd given her everything, and she'd taken it all. She'd taken his trust, his love, his business. And now, she was taking his legacy. But Frank realized, in that moment, that he was wrong. Emily hadn't taken his legacy. She'd taken the restaurant, the building, the equipment, the employees. But she hadn't taken his legacy. His legacy was his father's recipes, his techniques, his passion. His legacy was in the leather journal, in the fireproof safe, in the secret ingredient that no one else could replicate. "I can't give up," Frank said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty room. "I can't let her win. I have to fight back. I have to find a way to rebuild." And that's when the idea hit him. A brilliant idea, an audacious idea, an idea that would change everything. He would start over. He would open a new restaurant, a small one, a humble one. He would use the same recipes, the same techniques, the same love. He would build something new, something that would honor his father and continue his legacy. It wouldn't be the same as what he'd built before, but it might be better. It might be stronger. It might be more meaningful. Frank had a secret investor, a man named Jack Morrison, who'd been waiting for an opportunity to help him rebuild. Jack had been a customer at Frank's barbecue for years, had loved the food, had become a friend. He'd offered to help Frank anytime he needed it, and now Frank knew he'd need it. The next day, Frank called Jack and told him everything. The betrayal, the lawsuit, the theft. Jack listened silently, and when Frank was finished, he said, "Frank, I've been waiting for you to call. I've been waiting for you to ask for help. And now, I'm ready. Tell me what you need." Frank told him. He told him about his plan to start a new restaurant, to rebuild from scratch, to continue his legacy. Jack agreed to provide the capital, to help with the logistics, to support Frank every step of the way. "Frank, I believe in you," Jack said. "I've been eating your barbecue for 20 years, and I know it's the best in the state. You can't let Emily take that away from you. You've got to fight back. You've got to show her what you're made of." Frank felt a surge of hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. He had a plan, a partner, a purpose. He was going to rebuild. He was going to rise from the ashes. He was going to prove that even the greatest betrayal couldn't destroy the legacy of Frank Morrison. But Frank knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough. He needed evidence, concrete proof of what Emily and Mark had done. He needed to document every step of their theft, every lie they'd told, every law they'd broken. He started with the emails. He'd kept copies of all the emails Emily had sent him over the years, all the messages she'd exchanged with suppliers and employees. He went through them carefully, looking for anything that might prove her intentions. He found a lot. Emails about plans to open Sizzle, emails about poaching his employees, emails about contacting a food blogger to smear his restaurant. It was all there, in black and white, proof of Emily's betrayal. He also started recording his phone calls with Emily, documenting every conversation they had. He hired a private investigator to track Mark's financial dealings, to find out where the money was coming from, to expose the fraud he'd been committing. "I'm not going to let them get away with this," Frank told Leonard Schwartz. "I'm going to prove what they did. I'm going to show the world who they really are." Leonard nodded, a grim smile on his face. "That's the spirit, Frank. We're going to fight this. We're going to fight it together." One afternoon, a woman walked into Frank's new restaurant, a woman he'd never seen before. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a confident stride. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, a journalist for the Phoenix Times. "I'm working on a story about the barbecue scene in Phoenix," she said, taking a seat at the counter. "And I've heard that you're the man who started it all." Frank frowned, suspicious. "I'm just a cook, ma'am. I don't know about any story." Sarah smiled, a knowing smile. "I think you do, Frank. I think you know exactly what's going on. I think you know what your daughter and her husband did to you." Frank was silent for a long moment, studying the woman's face. She seemed sincere, but he'd learned not to trust people. He'd learned that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got customers to serve." Sarah didn't give up. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. She asked questions, listened carefully, took notes. She was patient and persistent, and eventually, she won Frank over. "All right," Frank said one afternoon, sitting down across from her. "I'll tell you the story. But you have to promise me that you'll tell it right. That you'll tell the truth." Sarah nodded. "I promise, Frank. I'll tell the truth." Frank told her everything. He told her about the betrayal, the theft, the lawsuit. He told her about his father's recipes, his mother's encouragement, his wife's support. He told her about the new restaurant, the secret ingredient, the hope that was slowly returning to his heart. Sarah listened carefully, her pen moving across the page. When Frank was finished, she said, "This is a powerful story, Frank. This is a story that needs to be told." As the weeks passed, Frank continued to gather evidence. He collected copies of Emily's emails, recorded her phone calls, documented her meetings with suppliers and employees. He built a case that was so airtight, so comprehensive, that Emily and Mark would have no way to deny their guilt. "I can't believe how much you've gathered," Leonard Schwartz said, reviewing the evidence. "This is incredible. This is more than enough to prove that Emily and Mark committed fraud." Frank nodded, but he didn't feel victorious. He felt sad, heartbroken, betrayed. He'd never wanted to go to war with his daughter. He'd never wanted to prove that she was a liar and a thief. But she'd left him no choice. She'd taken everything from him, and now, he had to fight back. "I hope she knows what she's done," Frank said quietly. "I hope she understands the pain she's caused." Leonard placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'll understand soon enough, Frank. She'll understand when she's facing the consequences of her actions." While Frank was gathering evidence, he was also building his new restaurant. He'd found a small space on the outskirts of Phoenix, a former diner that had seen better days. It was far from the grand, bustling restaurant he'd once owned, but it was perfect for what he needed. It was modest, humble, and manageable. It was a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the smells and sounds of real barbecue. Frank oversaw every aspect of the construction, from the installation of the smoker pit to the painting of the walls. He chose every piece of equipment, every table and chair, every plate and glass. He wanted everything to be perfect, not because he was trying to compete with his old restaurant, but because he wanted to honor his father's legacy. The most important part of the new restaurant, however, was the menu. Frank spent weeks perfecting his recipes, tweaking them to make them even better than before. He experimented with new rubs, new smoking techniques, new side dishes. He wanted his new restaurant to be different from the old one, but he also wanted it to be unmistakably Frank's. The sauce, of course, was the centerpiece. Frank had spent his life guarding the secret of the sauce, but now he realized that guarding it wasn't enough. He needed to build a brand around it, a story that would make it impossible for anyone to steal it again. He needed to make the sauce synonymous with Frank Morrison. "I'm going to call it Morrison's Legacy," Frank told Jack one evening, over a plate of ribs. "It's a tribute to my father. It's a tribute to everything he taught me." Jack took a bite and closed his eyes. "Frank, this is amazing. This is the best barbecue I've ever tasted. And that sauce. It's something else entirely." Frank smiled. "It's a secret. And it's going to stay a secret." The morning of the grand opening arrived with a crisp, clear sky and a sense of nervous anticipation that Frank hadn't felt in decades. He'd been up since 4 in the morning, preparing the meat, checking the smoker, making sure every detail was perfect. The new restaurant, which he'd decided to call Smokehouse, was a modest place, nothing like the sprawling establishment he'd once owned. But it was his, completely and entirely his, and that made all the difference. The first customer walked through the door at 11 o'clock sharp, an elderly man with a kind face and a friendly smile. Frank recognized him immediately. It was Tom Harrison, a loyal customer from his old restaurant who'd been coming to Frank's barbecue for 30 years. "Frank," Tom said, his eyes lighting up. "I heard you were opening a new place. I had to come and see for myself." Frank felt a lump form in his throat. "Tom, I'm so glad you're here. It means more than you know." Tom sat down at the counter and ordered a plate of ribs and a side of coleslaw. "And I've heard you've got a secret sauce," he added with a wink. "I'd like to try that too." Frank nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You won't be disappointed, Tom. That sauce is special. It's been in my family for generations." As Frank prepared the food, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. This was where he belonged. This was what he was meant to do. He was a cook, a smoker, a creator. He was Frank Morrison, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The first few weeks were slow, but Frank didn't mind. He knew that building a business took time, that word of mouth was the most powerful form of advertising. He had faith in his food, and he knew that eventually, people would come. And they did. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, customers started coming to Smokehouse. They came because they remembered Frank's old restaurant, or because they'd heard about it from friends, or because they'd read about the battle between Frank and his daughter in the local news. They came for the food, but they also came for the story. The local news had picked up the story of Frank's new restaurant, and suddenly, he was in the spotlight again. Reporters called, wanting interviews. Food bloggers visited, wanting to taste his barbecue. Customers flocked to the restaurant, wanting to be part of something special. "I can't believe this is happening," Frank told Jack one evening, after a particularly busy day. "I never expected this much attention." "Frank, you're a legend," Jack said, clapping him on the shoulder. "People want to see you succeed. They want to see you rise from the ashes. You're an inspiration." Frank shook his head, humbled. "I'm just a cook, Jack. I'm just doing what I love." But the attention wasn't all positive. Emily and Mark had been watching Frank's success with growing resentment, and they'd started a campaign to discredit him. They'd contacted food bloggers, accusing Frank of stealing their recipes. They'd filed complaints with the health department, claiming that Smokehouse was unsanitary. They'd even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Frank's past. "Frank, you need to be careful," Leonard Schwartz warned. "Emily and Mark are desperate. They'll do anything to destroy you." Frank nodded, his jaw set. "I know, Leonard. But I'm not going to let them win. I've come too far to give up now." The private investigator Emily and Mark had hired was a man named Victor Reyes, a former police officer with a reputation for getting results. Victor had been following Frank for weeks, documenting his movements, interviewing his acquaintances, digging into his past. But what Victor didn't know was that Frank had hired his own investigator, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been tracking Victor's movements as well. Patricia was a former FBI agent, sharp and resourceful, and she'd quickly discovered that Victor was working for Emily and Mark. "Frank, I've got something," Patricia said one afternoon, sitting in Frank's office. "Victor's been meeting with a food blogger named Jessica Lane. She's the one who's been writing those negative reviews about your restaurant." Frank felt a surge of anger. So they're working together. Emily, Mark, Victor, and Jessica. They're all in cahoots. "Exactly," Patricia said. "And I've got proof. I've got photographs of Victor and Jessica meeting, I've got recordings of their conversations, I've got copies of the emails they've been exchanging. We've got them, Frank. We've got them dead to rights." Frank stared at the evidence, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over him. He'd been fighting a defensive war for so long, reacting to Emily and Mark's attacks, trying to protect what was his. But now, he had the ammunition he needed to go on the offensive. Jessica Lane was a food blogger with a large following, known for her scathing reviews and her willingness to take bribes. She'd been paid by Emily and Mark to smear Frank's restaurant, to write negative reviews, to spread lies about the quality of his food. But Jessica had made a mistake. She'd left a trail of evidence, emails and text messages and financial records, that proved she was working for Emily and Mark. And Frank had gathered all of it. "Jessica," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. "I know about the deal you made with Emily and Mark. I know they paid you to write those negative reviews. I've got proof." Jessica's face went pale. "Frank, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never met Emily or Mark." "Don't lie to me," Frank said. "I've got copies of the emails, recordings of the phone calls, photographs of the meetings. I know everything." Jessica was silent for a long moment, her eyes starting nervously. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "What do you want from me, Frank?" "I want you to tell the truth," Frank said. "I want you to write a new review, one that tells the real story. I want you to expose Emily and Mark for what they are." Jessica nodded slowly. "I'll do it, Frank. I'll tell the truth." The new review was published a week later. It was titled "The Real Story Behind the Barbecue Wars," and it detailed everything: the bribes, the lies, the smear campaign. Jessica wrote about how Emily and Mark had paid her to write negative reviews, how they'd tried to destroy Frank's reputation, how they'd stolen his recipes and his employees. The review went viral. It was shared on social media, discussed on television, debated in newspapers. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Emily and Mark's betrayal, about Frank's resilience, about the battle between father and daughter. The fallout was immediate. Sizzle, which had been thriving, suddenly found itself in the midst of a PR nightmare. Customers started boycotting the restaurant, leaving negative reviews, spreading the word about the theft. Emily and Mark tried to defend themselves, but their explanations fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, Smokehouse was flooded with customers. People lined up out the door, eager to taste Frank's barbecue and show their support. Frank was overwhelmed by the response, humbled by the kindness of strangers. "I don't know what to say," Frank told a reporter who'd come to interview him. "I never expected this much support. I'm just grateful. Grateful to everyone who stood by me." While the public was turning against Emily and Mark, Frank's investigator, Patricia Chen, was digging deeper into their financial dealings. She'd discovered that Mark had been committing fraud for years, running a scheme that had defrauded dozens of investors. "Frank, this is huge," Patricia said, laying out a stack of documents on his desk. "Mark's been running a Ponzi scheme for the past 5 years. He's been taking money from investors, promising them huge returns, and then using the money to fund his lifestyle. He's defrauded millions of dollars." Frank stared at the documents, his heart pounding. "So it's not just the restaurant. He's been stealing from everyone." "Everyone," Patricia confirmed. "Investors, suppliers, even his own family. Emily didn't know about this. She thought he was legitimate. But he's been lying to her too." Frank felt a strange mix of emotions. He was angry, of course, angry at Mark for being such a con artist. But he also felt a flicker of pity for Emily. She'd been duped, manipulated, used by a man who'd never loved her. "What should I do with this evidence?" Frank asked. Patricia smiled grimly. "We give it to the authorities, Frank. We let them handle it. Mark's going to jail for a long time." The arrest came on a Thursday morning, a week after Patricia had turned over the evidence to the authorities. Mark was taken into custody at Sizzle, in front of his employees and customers. He was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, facing up to 20 years in prison. The news spread quickly. It was on television, in the newspapers, all over social media. Mark's empire, built on lies and theft, had come crashing down in spectacular fashion. Emily was devastated. She'd had no idea about Mark's fraud, no idea that he'd been lying to her for years. She'd believed in him, trusted him, loved him. And he'd betrayed her in the worst possible way. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." Frank looked at his daughter, seeing the pain in her eyes, the regret, the shame. She'd lost everything, her business, her reputation, her husband. She'd hit rock bottom, and she was finally realizing the consequences of her actions. "I know, Emily," Frank said quietly. "I know you didn't know. But you still made choices. You still chose to betray me, to steal from me, to try to destroy me. You made those choices, and you have to live with the consequences." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Dad. I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." The 40th anniversary of Frank's first restaurant was approaching, and Frank decided to celebrate it in a meaningful way. He'd been planning a special event for months, a celebration of his journey from a young man with a dream to an old man with a legacy. The anniversary party was held at Smokehouse, and it was a celebration of everything Frank had accomplished. Customers past and present came to pay tribute, to share their memories, to express their gratitude. It was a beautiful evening, filled with laughter and tears and the unmistakable scent of barbecue. As the evening wound down, Frank stood in the middle of the restaurant and addressed the crowd. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I started this journey 40 years ago, and I never imagined I'd be here today, celebrating with all of you. But I am, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for your support, your loyalty, your friendship. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do what I love, every single day." He paused, taking a sip of water to steady himself. "I've made mistakes over the years. I've trusted people who didn't deserve my trust. I've given my heart to people who didn't value it. But I've also learned something important. I've learned that love and integrity matter more than money and power. I've learned that the most valuable thing I have to offer isn't my food or my recipes. It's my heart. It's my willingness to keep going, even when everything seems lost." The crowd applauded, and Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. He was a lucky man. He'd been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, a chance to find meaning in the ashes of his broken dreams. After the party, Frank was cleaning up, his back aching and his feet tired. He was just about to lock up when the door opened and Emily walked in. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." Frank was surprised. He hadn't seen Emily in months, not since the news of Mark's arrest had broken. He'd heard through the grapevine that Sizzle was struggling, that Emily was trying to rebuild her life, but he hadn't reached out. He couldn't. The wounds were still too raw. "I don't know what to say, Emily," Frank said, his voice flat. "I don't know if there's anything to say." Emily stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know how I let myself get so lost." Frank stared at his daughter, seeing the pain in her eyes, the regret in her posture. She'd lost everything, her business, her reputation, her family. She'd hit rock bottom, and she was finally realizing the consequences of her actions. "I was jealous of you," Emily continued, her voice choked with emotion. "I was jealous of your success, your reputation, your relationship with Mom. I thought I deserved more than you were giving me. I thought I was entitled to it." Frank shook his head slowly, a wave of sadness washing over him. "You were never entitled to any of it, Emily. You had to earn it. You had to work for it. That's what I tried to teach you. That's what your mother tried to teach you. But you didn't listen." "I know, Dad," Emily said. "I know. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Frank was silent for a long moment, wrestling with his emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive Emily, to take her in his arms and tell her everything was okay. But part of him was still hurt, still angry, still trying to understand how she could have done what she did. "Forgiveness is a journey, Emily," he said finally. "It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something you can demand. It's something you have to earn. And you have a long way to go." Emily nodded, her face pale. "I know, Dad. I know. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her. He saw the pain in her eyes, the regret, the determination. He saw the daughter he'd raised, the daughter he'd loved, the daughter who'd gotten lost but was now trying to find her way back. "All right, Emily," he said softly. "All right. Let's see where this goes." Frank's cookbook, The Real Recipe, was published a few months later. It was a labor of love, a collection of recipes and stories that spanned his entire career. It included the recipe for his famous barbecue sauce, the one his father had passed down to him, the one he'd guarded for so long. The book was a sensation. It was reviewed in major newspapers, featured on cooking shows, recommended by celebrity chefs. It climbed the bestseller lists, surprising everyone, including Frank. "I never expected this," Frank told Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who'd written the exposé. "I just wanted to share my recipes. I wanted to share my story. I didn't think anyone would care." "Frank, your story is inspiring," Sarah said. "It's about resilience, about persistence, about refusing to give up. People need to hear that. They need to know that even when everything seems lost, there's always hope." Frank nodded slowly, a new sense of purpose settling over him. He'd spent 40 years building a business, had watched it crumble, and had built it again from scratch. He'd been betrayed, humiliated, and broken. But he'd also been rebuilt, redeemed, and renewed. As the years passed, Frank's legacy continued to grow. Smokehouse became a local institution, a place where people came for good food and warm company. Frank mentored young chefs, taught them the art of smoking meat, instilled in them the values of patience and integrity. "I'm not going to live forever," Frank told his protégés one evening, a group of young men and women who'd come to learn from him. "But I can teach you. I can pass on what I know. And that way, a part of me will live on." The young chefs listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. They'd heard stories about Frank's journey, about his triumph over adversity, about his refusal to give up. They wanted to be like him, to have the same passion, the same dedication, the same love for the craft. "Always remember," Frank said, "that cooking isn't just about feeding people. It's about nourishing them. It's about creating something that brings people together. It's about making the world a better place, one meal at a time." Emily worked hard to earn back Frank's trust. She helped out at Smokehouse, learned the business from the ground up, showed her father that she was serious about changing. It was a slow process, a difficult process, but eventually, Frank began to see the old Emily, the one he'd raised, the one he'd loved. "I'm proud of you, Emily," Frank said one day, after she'd spent hours scrubbing the smoker. "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming." Emily looked up, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me." Frank knew that they would never be as close as they once were. The wounds were too deep, the scars too permanent. But they'd found a way forward, a way to be civil, a way to be family. And that was enough. Mark, meanwhile, was facing his own reckoning. He'd been convicted of fraud and embezzlement, sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His investors had sued him, his assets had been seized, his reputation had been destroyed. Frank didn't know where Mark was, and honestly, he didn't care. Mark had made his choices, and he'd have to live with the consequences. He'd stolen from Frank, from Emily, from countless others. He'd destroyed lives, families, futures. And now, he was paying the price. "I hope he finds some peace," Frank said one evening, when Emily asked about Mark. "I hope he finds a way to make amends. But that's up to him. That's not my responsibility." On a warm Sunday evening, Frank sat on the porch of his small house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red. He was alone, but he didn't feel lonely. He had his memories, his recipes, his legacy. He thought about his father, about the man who'd taught him to cook, about the lessons he'd passed down through generations. He thought about his mother, about the woman who'd encouraged him, believed in him, pushed him to take a chance on himself. He thought about Margaret, about the woman who'd loved him, supported him, stood by him through every challenge. And he thought about Emily, about the daughter he'd almost lost, about the woman she was becoming. She wasn't the same person who'd betrayed him. She'd changed, grown, learned from her mistakes. She was earning back his trust, one day at a time. "Dad," Frank whispered, "I hope I've made you proud. I hope I've carried on your legacy. I hope I've done justice to your recipes." A breeze rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Frank felt his father's presence, a warm hand on his shoulder, a whisper in his ear. "Good job, son," the voice seemed to say. "Good job." Frank smiled, a peaceful smile, and closed his eyes. He was ready for what came next. He'd lived a full life, a meaningful life, a life that had made a difference. And that was enough.